Welcome back. This is week 2, lecture 2, with the title, if I look here, Political Theory, Political Power, and Ecclesiopolitics in the Later Middle Ages. Now, I referred to the late medieval crisis in the last lecture and the crisis in authority and power. I think I mentioned the fissures that became more intense and more apparent as we move into the 14th century, this period of crisis and reformation. And one of the major ways that was in terms of the political aspects was renewed conflict between popes and princes, or between the emperor and king of France, particularly. I'll be talking about this in the popes. It's not that they had not had conflicts before. In the late 11th century, under Pope Gregory VII, there was a movement that Gregory basically initiated, referred to as the Gregorian Reforms, and under the title or the slogan, the freedom of the church. And that was to free the church from lay control. If we go back to that model that I talked about in last week's lecture in terms of the basic structures of Christendom and manorialism and the proprietary churches, which I said was not only for the manor, but then would work itself all the way up to the highest levels, whereby the prince, or the lord of the manor, or the prince or the king, considered the church part of their own property, and it's part of their responsibility as the ordained rulers ordained by God to provide for the spiritual well-being of their people as well as the physical well-being of the people. As we get into the 11th century, so the 1000s, there began to be this conflict of how do we distinguish ecclesiastical power from lay power. Now, I think I mentioned too at that time that, or if I didn't, I'm going to repeat it now, but I think I said I would be repeating it again and again and again throughout this course, is that there was no such thing as the separation of church and state. There was no such thing as a conflict between church and state. There certainly was a conflict between ecclesiastical power and lay power, or between the clergy and the laity. And this had to do with the sacraments. Because only if you were ordained could you affect the sacraments. Like it's in the whole theology, the sacramental theology. But the idea was that even the emperor could not celebrate mass, even if he knew how to say all the words. He knew all the what to do and the actions. He could go to the altar and do everything right. Get to the words of institution, hoc est corpus meum. This is my body, and nothing would happen. There'd be no transformation of the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ. Only an ordained priest could do that. And in that sense, on that level, the simple parish priest was higher even than the emperor. And the emperor realized that in terms of that function. The problem was, what did that mean? How does that really work? And how do you put these two different powers and ruling powers together? And Gregory VII, Pope Gregory VII, claimed that we need to free the church from lay control, from this, we get away from this idea of this proprietary church, because the church for Gregory was defined as the clerics. Now, there are different definitions of church. So if you want to claim that there was a conflict of church and state, which I think is a horrible term to use, but is used very frequently, that can only be valid historically if we equate the church with the ecclesiastical hierarchy and quote unquote the state with princely power and rule. Now, those are both problematic definitions, but at least with the church as referring to the ecclesiastical hierarchy, that was an historical definition of the time, in part because everyone agreed that the church, as the body of Christ, with Christ as the head of the church, was most accurately, most really, the body of believers. the body of the faith, the communion of the faithful, communion in the sense of community, the communio fidelium. That was the church. It was only then, if we, it's called pars pro toto, if we take a part of that church and then refer to that part as representing the whole. But the church was always the whole. So the emperor was a part of the church as much as the pope was a part of the church. The question was then, who led the church? And in medieval Christendom, the church was also the state. It was also that entity that was Christendom, which was not a state. That state is a modern concept, and I think, as I said earlier on, we'll see it towards the end of this course, when we see that this transformation from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. This concept of state is really emerging only during the course of the 16th century. And so it's even anachronistic to refer it back and talking about medieval states. It doesn't really get at what was going on, to looking at political entities. So the question was, this concept of Christendom as a whole is a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship, was synonymous with the church. And that was accepted on both sides, basically, both sides of the debate, the imperial side or the princely side and the ecclesiastical side. We need to get through this, our heads in this. The question was, which power, these two powers, in general seen as the temporal lay power and the spiritual ecclesiastical power, how do they work together? Theoretically, they cooperate and they harmonize. From early on, these two powers, the lay power and the clerical power, temporal power, spiritual power, the conflict was there, but they were related to body and soul. Whereas the temporal power related to the body, the ecclesiastical power related to the soul. Because the whole point was eternal salvation or damnation. And the spiritual power, the clergy, made possible salvation for eternity, for the spirit of the soul that would, continue to live after the body dies. The soul is eternal. Oh, well and good, but how do those two spheres relate when human beings are a combination of body and soul? What does that mean for authority and power? So if I have power over the body, does that mean I also have power over the soul? Or if I have power over the soul, does that mean I also have power over the body? And this is a real conflict. And this attempt by Pope Gregory VII to free the church from lay control was saying that the spiritual power is the higher power. Now they said, agreed, Gregory would say, theoretically, the spiritual power should not interfere in temporal affairs, because we are dealing with, as clergy, as papacy and so, are dealing with the spiritual side of human experience and life, which looks towards human salvation, and not with, wars and politics and who's fighting whom and all those types of things. Nice, neat distinction until we look at reality, because if the clergy was responsible for the soul, and if sin was a negative effect on the soul, affecting the potentiality for eternal salvation, as no one questioned that, then if something is a sin, and if the clergy says that's a sin, you need to stop doing that. If the laity does not stop, there's a problem, because they then are persisting in sin, which is even a greater sin than recognizing your sin and repenting of it and confessing it and being absolved from it. In causa peccati, in the case of sin, led to the interference or influence or intersection of the spiritual and the temporal realms. For example, if a Christian prince was going to war and fighting another Christian prince, if the Pope deemed that first Christian prince had been doing so unjustly, unfairly, illegitimately, fighting against another Christian brother, is a sin. So the Pope would say, you have to stop that, and if you don't, you're persisting in sin. Oh, And the Pope said, I'm not interfering in temporal affairs. I'm concerned for the salvation of your soul, Prince A, who was attacking illegitimately Prince B. So you can see all of a sudden it gets very murky where that line is. Now, Gregory, here I am talking this whole time about Gregory the Seventh. It's not even part of the PowerPoint slide, and it's even before the Reformation in the later Middle Ages, a couple hundred years, 300 years before, 250 years before, because 1077 was the big conflict. Gregory that excommunicates Emperor Henry IV, because Henry IV was doing just that. And then Henry IV realized he had to kind of make up with the Pope. For political purposes, because Henry couldn't care. He didn't really think Gregory the Seventh had much to do with anything in reality. You have letters back and forth, and Gregory the Seventh would write to Henry the Fourth as Henry, who's pretending to be emperor, and Henry would write to Hildebrand, who claims to be pope. We'll see that same kind of dynamic very shortly in the 14th century in terms of Pope John the 22nd and Louis of Bavaria. Now, this investiture controversy ended in a compromise. It didn't resolve itself until early 12th century by the successors of Gregory VII and Henry IV. So Henry V and actually Calixtus II. But that's a whole nother development. But it gets at the atmosphere and the tensions that are there, because then as we move on from the 12th century on into the 13th century, we have increasing assertions of papal authority and supremacy, even over temporal affairs, and we have the development of what was called, has been called papal monarchy. And the imagery and the symbolism evolved with both imperial symbols and papal symbols started to merge. And so the Pope becomes also symbolically more and more like the Emperor, and the Emperor becomes symbolically more and more like the Pope, and there's this real conflict. And it's only in the context of papal monarchy in the 13th century with Innocent III that we start having reference to the Pope as the Vicar of Christ. The Emperor traditionally have been referred to himself as the office as the Vicar of God, ruling of God on earth. That's then in some ways the papacy kind of won, because that title kind of slipped by the wayside, and the Vicar of Christ became applied to the Pope as the successor of St. Peter in apostolic succession, one after the other. That's the context we face when we get to the later 13th century, this continued struggle between Pope and Emperor, between princes and Emperor, between princes and the Emperor, and the Pope and the Emperor. It's all messed up. If I'm King of France, what's my relationship to the Emperor? If I'm, as we will see shortly again, if I'm King of Naples, what's my relationship to the Emperor? If I'm Pope, what's my relationship to the Emperor? If I'm Emperor, what's my relationship to the Pope? If I'm King of France, what's my relationship to the Pope? Or some of the archbishops in my realm? What do we do? How do we handle that? Because if I'm King of France, I am responsible for my people. And if the ecclesiastical power, the ecclesiastical hierarchy tries to interfere with that, damn it, that is jeopardizing my salvation, because I'm going to have to answer to God when I die for how well I have fulfilled my ordained, divinely ordained responsibilities, including providing for the spiritual well-being of my people. But the priesthood, the clergy, on the other hand, have the same tension, because they're responsible. So if you have two people that see themselves as responsible for the people, and not just for their temporal well-being, but for their spiritual well-being, which means for their eternal salvation, if souls go to hell, that's then on me. That was the princely perspective, the imperial perspective. There's also the papal or ecclesiastical perspective. If souls end up, if someone in my care, whom I'm responsible for, goes to hell, I'm responsible and will have to answer to God for it. We'll see more of that dynamic in other aspects of the religio political church spiritual life of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and subsequent lectures. But that's kind of the context that we're talking about. When this conflict that had been ongoing in some ways since Constantine, when Constantine legalizes Christianity and calls the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, that sets Christian doctrine, that sets the canon of Scripture, starts condemning heresy. How do we go about solving that conflict? Now, there wasn't a big conflict in the time of Constantine because the Pope, as the Bishop of Rome, didn't have that much authority and power, and was, until Constantine legalizes Christianity, was still Bishop of Rome, but was illegally so in terms of the Roman Empire. That changes with Constantine, and then really changes with Theodosius, and then changes again in some ways with Charlemagne and the establishment or the reestablishment of the Roman Empire in the West. And then with Otto I, it's the Holy Roman Empire. How do you put those together? There was a phrase, a little fun phrase that's certainly not mine, but I don't know who first coined this phrase. But the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And in some ways, that was very true in terms of the political reality on the ground. But ideally, the myth, ideologically, it was still the Holy Roman Empire. How do you put the Holy and the Roman together in terms of empire? How does it work, and how do you make that fit? That was the struggle and the tension that had been there all along inherently, at times breaking out very, very dramatically, like with Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. And then again, Innocent III and Frederick II, talking about those issues. But then in the late 13th century, the proverbial, excuse my language here, but the proverbial shit really hits the fan. The conflict between the papacy and the King of France. But we'll get there. To get there, we then have to go to our first slide, which then is Papal Imperial Conflict, Boniface VIII and Philip IV. Now, in that context, Boniface VIII is Pope and Philip IV is the King of France. But to understand this conflict, we need to go back to 1492. Because in 1492, Pope Nicholas IV dies. So Pope dies. What has to happen when a Pope dies? There has to be a papal election. Because as I said, both the Emperor and the Pope were elected offices. Who elects the Pope? The Cardinals. College of Cardinals, they get together. Problem was, there was a lot of politicking, political infighting amongst the Cardinals, and they couldn't come up with a unanimous decision on who should be Pope. One of the Cardinals was a man by the name of Benedict Gaetani. He certainly was very ambitious. He would love to have been Pope. He was sort of campaigning for it. But one of the problems was you had other cardinals from another Italian family, because the Gaetani were an Italian family, but other cardinals were from the Colonna family, and they were opponents of the Gaetani in Italian politics. They were of older wealth, the Colonna, whereas the Gaetani were seen as the nouveau riche. I mean, that's not the term that was used at the time, but they were the newcomers, so suspect, with old wealth being suspect of new wealth. And the Cardinals, because of this conflict between these two Italian families, could not come up with an agreed upon Pope. And this struggle went on for a couple of years, until 1294, when they finally did something actually that was interesting. They selected a spiritual man as Pope. It was a compromised candidate. But if there ever was a spiritual Pope, I'm not going to go through every Pope and rank them in terms of their spirituality, but Peter Morone was that person. Peter Morone was a Franciscan, and a Franciscan who went off to live by himself as a hermit. He was already at the time venerated in the region, in Tuscany, as this holy man. So he was seen as a living saint, completely dedicated to the spiritual pursuits of his own life and those around him. And he was elected Pope because the cardinal said, okay, we got to get somebody. Hey, how about him? We can't say no, he's not going to be Pope. We can't vote against a spiritual man of God, obviously. And, he'll be kind of a holding Pope until we can really get a more permanent one after he dies, because he won't last all that long, we don't think. So they elect Peter Morone as Pope. And Peter Morone, supposedly, as tradition has it, when a delegation came to find him up in the Tuscan hills to tell him that he'd been elected Pope, he wept. It's the last thing he wanted to be. He took the name, though, Celestian V. And if ever a pope was appropriately named, it was Celestian, which means heavenly. Now, this also points at something else. Theoretically, anyone could be elected pope. You don't have to be a cardinal, member of the College of Cardinals. You don't have to be a cardinal. You don't have to be a bishop. You do not even have to be ordained to be elected pope. We'll get to that in a second. And this time, that was not really a consideration. That was a theoretical development that in this conflict started coming out, but we'll get there when we get there. And so Peter Morone takes the name of Celestian V and goes to Rome and starts trying to be Pope. Problem is, to be Pope is to be basically a temporal leader as well. The papal states are still there, and you have to manage international politics, and you have to be able to play hardball. And Celestian didn't want to do anything like that. Stories were, we don't know if this is true or not, that he would issue blank papal bulls because he didn't want to deal with things. So now, what's a papal bull? A papal bull, actually, technically, the bull law is the wax seal. And so if you have an official document coming from the Pope, it is sealed with that wax, with the imprint seal. I'll come back to that in a second because that's going to be very important. The imprinted seal of the papacy and the Pope. Princes had their seals and everything else, but it's only papal seals that we refer to as bulls by the bull law, because the bull law is that wax seal, which is the same word that is used for princely or kingly or whatever. Lay seals are also bulla or bullae in the plural, but we don't refer to princely bulls. We refer to papal bulls, and with all the double entendres of those kinds of jokes, it's just a bunch of papal bull. But that's what the papal bull means. They're usually referred to by the the first 2 or 3 or so words of in the Latin title, the Latin decree. But they are decrees, proclamations of the Pope officially. Supposedly Celestian just would say, fill it in whatever you want. Boom, here's my my seal, my signature, papal bull. There you go. Let's say, oh, okay, great, Celestian. How can I get one of these bulls? Sure. Here. And then I fill it in. I, Celestian, proclaim, you, Professor Sack, completely absolved from all of your sins that you have committed or that you will commit. And I will attest to St. Peter's for your, entry into heaven or something. I'm just making this up, of course. But that's the thing that theoretically could have been done. It's like writing a blank check. If you, just say, okay, fine, I have a checkbook. I will write my check. You can fill it in any way you want. It's like, cool. He did not want to be Pope, and he was tired of it. And by December of 1294, he resigns. Now, this is a big problem. Can he resign from being Pope? Hmm. That came up not that long ago, in the 1990s, with the election of Pope Francis, because Pope Benedict the 16th resigned. He's still alive, I believe. He's still alive. He was getting too old and he quit. The question was, no one had resigned, no Pope had resigned since Celestine V. So it was kind of a big deal. Now, Benedict Gaetani was one of the cardinals, as I said, and he argued for the legitimacy of Celestine's resignation. The legal, in terms of canon law, ecclesiastical law, he argued before the College of Cardinals that they should accept Celestine's resignation. And they did, at least superficially, at the time. But then, of course, they needed to have a new election. And by this time, even though the political tensions were still pretty high, Benedict Gaetani was able to pull it off politically, and he was elected as Pope, and he took the name of Boniface. And he was the 8th Boniface, so he became Pope Boniface the 8th. And immediately there was opposition to his election by the Colonna. You can say, well, why didn't they, try to block him? Well, it's a good question. They started arguing that Boniface was not legitimately elected and that you cannot resign the papacy and that Celestine was still Pope. And this thing was all rigged by Boniface, by Benedict Gaetani, to get himself elected Pope. They even started to accuse Boniface of all types of things. And this conflict was just going to continue, as we'll see more as it goes. And what we know about Boniface, what we legitimately know about Boniface, some of the accusations very well could have been true. Boniface was a brilliant canon lawyer, very bright, very knowledgeable in canon law, and very ambitious for his family, the Gaetani, and for himself. And all of a sudden, he found himself as Pope. He had finagled it. He certainly had presented Celestine's case for resignation before the College of Cardinals. And the Colonna Cardinals started arguing that not only had Boniface presented the case, but he also had coerced and tricked Celestine into resigning. What did he do? No, we don't know if this is true. It's certainly something that Boniface might have done. But what he was actually accused of, and we have these documents, and I'm characterizing and paraphrasing and dramatically play it out a little bit, but we do have these documents extant with charging Benedict Gaetani or Boniface VIII with having done this. Supposedly they said that Benedict Gaetani, before he was elected Boniface, went to Celestine's bedroom at night outside the window and said, Celestine, Celestine. What? Yes. What is it? This is the Lord. Oh, Lord. Knowing Celestine, Peter Marone, was a very spiritual man, open to divine visitations. What is it, Lord? I'm your servant. Here I am. You don't want to be Pope, do you, Celestine? No, Lord, I don't want to be Pope. Then resign, Celestine. What? I can resign? Yes, Celestine, you can resign. Oh, thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. I resign. The Colonna actually accused Boniface of that, as well as anything and everything you could possibly imagine: sodomy, incest, etc. They threw everything at him that they possibly could. And again, what we know about Boniface, a lot of that could have been true. We don't know if any of it was. That's the point. This is the basis of documentation. We have the charges, we have the defenses, the denials, but we don't have the evidence to support those denials, except for the theoretical arguments to support the legitimacy of Boniface's election, which I'll get to in a moment. So there's this conflict within the College of Cardinals. It gets worse because Boniface starts realizing he's governing the church. There's a problem in France with the King of France, Philip IV. Why? Because Philip started imposing taxes on his clergy. That's a no-no. Today, church lands are tax exempt. They were back in the day too. But why did Philip IV do this? He had a problem. I mentioned in a previous lecture that the Hundred Years' War starts in 1336, but that England and France had been fighting almost continuously. You could almost call it the 500-year war or so. Uh, Philip had been fighting England, and he was running out of money. He needed more money to continue fighting the English. So he said, where am I going to get more money? I've taxed my nobles about as much as I possibly can without them kind of revolting. But wait a minute, the church, I haven't taxed the church, the bishops, the archbishops. If I levy a tax on them, I could raise more revenue. It's for them anyway because it's for France. They should pay their share. And Philip did that. And the clergy in France took exception to it and appealed to Boniface. And Boniface says, why? You can't tax the clergy. And he condemns Philip IV's taxing of the clergy in his bull, Sculta Filii, saying that that is only something that the papacy, at the very least, would have to approve. Now, this bull caused outrage. It was seen within France as Boniface trying to interfere with the internal affairs of France. They kind of worked out a compromise. Okay, well, you could, again, if you get papal permission, but you can't just impose taxes on church lands without papal permission. But in this case, okay, this one time I'll give papal permission and it's okay, but theoretically, you can't do it. So, crisis solved, or so it seemed, except this really upset the French. And all of a sudden, Boniface had created a whole other set of enemies, the French nobility and Philip IV. It got even so bad that they started circulating fake bulls around France, claiming, false information, fake news, forged bulls that they attributed to Boniface that asserted far more papal privilege than Boniface even would have asserted, or at least that he did assert. So there gets to be great animosity against Boniface within France. And they team up, the French team up with the Colonna Cardinals to work together. We have to get rid of frickin' Boniface. That's the problem. We have to get rid of this Pope. He's a renegade. And the Colonna Cardinals, you absolutely. The damn Gaetani. It gets going back and forth. And I'm just going to check if I can do this well. In 1296, so just 2 years after the election, Boniface got some help defending his position. And it came from Aegidius Romanus, or Giles of Rome, who was at the time when he wrote in 1296, he was the Archbishop of Bourges, which is one of the major archbishoprics in France. He had been the prior general of the Augustinian hermits. We're talking about more about Giles later, too, both in this lecture and then in the lecture on the Augustinian Renaissance, because he really sits at the beginnings of this Augustinianism in the later Middle Ages. But that's a whole other story, which then leads to Luther. Blah 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 blah. But Giles of Rome had been head of his order, and Philip IV appoints Giles to the Archbishop of Bourges. This is very early on in Boniface's career, before the whole outbreak of the taxation problem and taxing the clergy. Boniface approves it, of course, because Giles was a close associate of Benedict Gaetani's. They'd been working together in Rome. They knew each other. They were buddies. Pope Nicholas the Fourth had sent them on a delegation to Paris to deal with opposition within the University of Paris, within the Masters of Theology. The secular Masters of Theology were opposed to the new mendicant Masters of Theology, and there was opposition, and they wanted to get rid of the mendicant, the Franciscans, Augustine, Dominicans, Masters of Theology, and Pope said, no, absolutely not, and sent Benedict Gaetani and Giles of Rome to go deal with the problem, in which he said, the phrase is a wonderful phrase, he goes, I would bring the University of Paris to its knees before I would expel the mendicants. That is the situation. Boniface is great. Giles is my buddy. But Philip IV, Giles is also my buddy. Philip's father, Philip III, liked Giles, started privileging Giles, and asked Giles to write a book about how to rule for his son, the future Philip IV, which Giles did. De Regimini Principum, on the rule of princes. And that became one of the most widely spread, most influential treatises on, that's called Mirror of Princes, to say this is what a Christian prince should be like, in all these different ways. That work has never been translated, and it has never been edited, which is a whole other issue, but Giles of Rome has been so overlooked unrightly. Everyone knows how important this treatise was, but no one's taken the time actually to edit it and to translate it so we can read it and talk about it. You have to read it in Latin in an early printed edition or the manuscripts themselves. So he's very close. And Philip IV, when Giles is elected in 1292 as prior general of the Augustinians, started privileging Giles and started giving Giles and the Augustinians territory. He gave them more territory in Paris to build another monastery in Paris, kind of right downtown. And the document says explicitly, based on our love for Brother Giles, we're donating to the Augustinian hermits this land. So Giles was very well connected and very tight with both Philip IV and with Boniface. So when there's conflict, what do? Well, Giles sided with Boniface and wrote a treatise in 1296 on renouncing or resigning the papacy, the Renunciatio Papae, which gave the theological and the legal basis for Celestian's resignation and therefore for Boniface's legitimacy. And all of a sudden, then, the die was cast and Giles had sided with Boniface. Now you can say, well, why did he do that? Think about it. Giles, even though he was Archbishop Bourges, he had been prior general of the Augustinians. And he always, that we can tell, had the order as his overarching concern and what would be best for the order. So if I side with, we don't know that he was arguing this. We don't have the documents to know that he was arguing this, but we can speculate. The argument was, or the calculation was, if I'm Giles, if I side with Philip IV, the Augustinians will be flowing and privileged in France, but not necessarily anywhere else. If I side with Boniface, Boniface is Pope of the entire Christendom, an entire world. It's best for the order if we go with Boniface in the papacy, which then he does. Puts him at odds with Philip IV. So that is where that starts to be an issue. And it wasn't just Giles, even though he was very strongly supportive of Boniface, but the Augustinians, based on Giles's lead, as such, became the primary architects of the papal political theory and supporters of the Pope. James of Viterbo was the successor of Giles as the master regent, the regent master, the reigning master of Paris, as it's so called. Giles was the first Augustinian hermit to have a chair in theology at Paris. And then he leaves to become Archbishop of Bourges. He's followed by James of Viterbo. In 1300, James of Viterbo writes this treatise De Regimine Christiano on the Christian empire, on the Christian rule, dedicated to Boniface. Now, Giles wrote one in 1302, treatise De Ecclesiastica Potestate. It has always been assumed that Giles wrote his treatise first, and James basically kind of copied Giles, so to speak. But I think I've shown, or in my mind, I've shown, not that everybody accepts my position, but it's out there. But actually, James wrote his first, and it should be dated, 1299, 1300. And then Giles wrote his more quickly in 1301, 1302. Both were needed because things were really getting nasty between Philip IV and Boniface VIII. What do we do about it all? I'm not sure. Boniface said, I'll call church council. That's what I'll do. Because Philip IV is running amok. And he's spreading these fake news throughout France about what I'm claiming, which I'm not even claiming that, even though I might agree with some of those claims. I haven't asserted those things. And for Philip and the French, it's like, how dare the Pope try to dictate what we do here in France? So Boniface calls the council to meet in Rome. They meet. Not sure what to do about it. Not very many French cardinals or abbots of monasteries or members of the mendicant orders or bishops. Not all that many went. Giles, as Archbishop of Bourges, did go and stayed in Rome thereafter. And really didn't do anything. And Boniface said, yeah, Philip IV really shouldn't be doing some of these things. And there's wars going on and blah, 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 blah. It gets more complicated. But the gist of it is they condemned some of the actions, but did not condemn Philip IV himself. And disbanded. And Boniface said, this is not really a solution. I have to somehow deal with this problem. So sat down in November of 1302 and wrote what is one of the most infamous, if not the most infamous, papal bulls of the Middle Ages, under the name Unam Sanctam, because that is how the bull begins. Unam Sanctam Ecclesiam Catholicam, which is the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. No, one Holy Catholic Church. From the Creed. In this document, Boniface asserts that every Christian must be directly subject to the Pope for salvation. He asserts, as part of papal policy, a lot of the claims of the authority, supremacy, and power of the papacy and the ecclesiastical hierarchy that Gregory VII, back in the 12th century, 11th century, had done in a document known as the Dictatus Papae of 1075. But that document was never an official proclamation of the Pope. We found that this document, or it was found, this document, inserted in the registers of Gregory VII, meaning the collection of letters that he had. And there's no indication that he ever promulgated it, that he made it an official document, a doctrine. It's been argued that he was, maybe thinking of a wish list to get his conflict with Henry, to maybe say, okay, Henry, I'll admit you if you sign and agree to these points. But in Unam Sanctam, Boniface makes that official policy of the supremacy of the Pope. And Philip IV is what? Now, Boniface based his argument, including cutting and pasting word for word at times from Giles of Rome's treatise De Ecclesiastica Potestate. There we go. Boniface is supporting Giles, starts giving more benefits and privileges to the Augustinians. He showers Giles with things and with privilege for the Augustinians. The Augustinians are really getting themselves established within the church as a whole. They're much more recent than the Franciscans and Dominicans. They're only established in 1256 by Pope Alexander IV. And Giles provided the argument not only for the legitimacy of Boniface's election, but also for, oh my, his unum sanctum. Philip IV was astounded. How can this be? Something has to be done. Philip. This goes beyond all rational thought. No one would claim these types of claims previously. Boniface is actually heretical. He's making heretical statements. So we need to go and capture him and bring him back and try him for heresy in Paris. And that's what Philip sets out to do. He sends a contingent to go get Boniface. This became known as the debacle at Anagni. Major event. Boniface actually was not in Rome. He was in Anagni, which is a village outside of Rome. It was part of the family holdings of the Anagni. So Boniface had kind of gone back to his family home. There, the French troops, led by Peter Flotte, one of the major advisors to Philip IV, went into the city, went looking for Boniface, went to his house, found him in his bedroom. And supposedly, according to the stories, and if we do have, again, stories, eyewitness accounts, but it's difficult to prove, but theoretically, what supposedly said to have happened was that Boniface was in his nightshirt. He was in bed. He got out, got down on his knees, opened up his nightshirt. He says, "Here's my neck. Go ahead." Peter Flotte was like, "Uh-oh. What do I do now? Do we just whack off his head here and there and get it over and done with? Or do we just kind of, tie him up and take him back to Paris as Philip told us to?" As he's trying to figure out what to do, the townspeople of Anagni issued a counterattack to defend Boniface. So all of a sudden, Peter Flotte, with Boniface there on his knees with his neck, saying, "Go for it. Go ahead. Lop it off." Had to be called away to help defend his troops against the townspeople who are fighting against the French troops, which he does and just leaves Boniface there. And the townspeople were able to defeat the French contingent because it wasn't, Philip said they don't need that many people to go get the damn Pope. He's an old man anyway. He was an old man. And they went back to France without Boniface. This is called the debacle in Anagni. Essentially, the Pope had been mugged. It was shocking, absolutely shocking throughout Europe. Dante, the Italian poet Dante, was scandalized and shocked. Now, Dante hated Boniface. Dante put him in the, I think the 8th level of hell in his Inferno. But you don't do that to the Pope. You still respect the office of the papacy, even if you can't stand the individual. You don't go mug the Pope. Well, Boniface, we thought it was safe, got up, went outside. He absolved the townspeople from any sins they might have made in coming to his defense. Thought, I better get back to Rome to deal with this. Went back to Rome and dies. 1303. Now what? There has to be another papal election. Philip IV says, "Whew, we won." The Colonna says, "Thank God, at least he's dead." But the shock of Anagni remained. This had never happened before. Gregory VII, Henry IV, we had the dramatic event of Emperor Henry IV going in rags and being on his knees in the snow for 3 days, trying to do penance to make up with Gregory. That was just, let's say, a normal part of the way things worked, even if it was more dramatic, because most emperors never would have done such a thing, but Henry did. The situation was dire enough it kind of necessitated those types of drastic measures. But no one had attacked the Pope. You can yell at the Pope, you can call him whatever you want to call him. You don't mug the Pope. But Philip feels he's vindicated in some ways. And the new Pope that became elected, actually it was Benedict XI or something like that, I forget, he didn't last very long, he died in office, was then Clement V. Clement, as you can kind of see, Clement was French. And Clement said, you know what? Things are so chaotic in Rome. I can't govern in Rome. There's too many factions. I'm going to move and go somewhere else to govern the church outside the absolute chaos politically and everything else and clamoring of the crowds and factions. So he goes to a place called Avignon. Avignon, French sounds. Technically, it was not part of the Kingdom of France, but it is north of the Alps. It is in southern France. And he set up shop in Avignon and began, that was in 1309. He was elected in 1305, 1309. He moves to Avignon and began something that he did not foresee, because the papacy stayed in Avignon until 1377. It's called the Avignonese papacy. Major problem. Francesco Petrarca, the father of humanism, even though his father worked in Avignon, he grew up in Avignon, but he thought it was horrific, and he referred to the Avignonese papacy, the papacy in Avignon, as the Babylonian captivity of the church. Now, that's a title of a work of Martin Luther, the Babylonian captivity. We'll talk about that when we get there. That concept was there, that somehow the church had been captured by Babylon. Who's the Antichrist? The whore of Babylon is the symbol of the Antichrist. Babylon was who held God's chosen people in slavery, held them captive. Now I get a positive image. Anyway, Clement realized things had to be done, things had to change. We have to have a plan. But that brings me then to the next phase of this papal imperial conflict, which is ended up being between John the 22nd and Louis of Bavaria. But I need to just stop here. I think not because I'm making a mistake and clicking myself off, but I've already gone. I can see now on my clock here for 53 minutes. And I'm just halfway through. So I need to think a little bit about how to go about doing this in terms of finishing the rest of this lecture, which I think is so important for understanding what's coming out before doing a part 2 of week 2, lecture 2. So I'm just going to end it here, and then I'll be back and post part 2 sometime soon. And hopefully it won't be too taxing for all of you, but this is the first part of this lecture. Okay, so I'll be back before too long, I hope, to finish this with part 2. But here we are now with Clement and Avignon, and we'll see what happens then. Take care.